So this evening's talk is called Mindfulness Then and Now. And I want to begin the talk by going back in time, back to 2,500 years, to an example of extraordinary mindfulness, to an account of the Buddha's final days from his Parinibbana, the sutta that tells the account of the Buddha's final days. And it's an extraordinary story about the ideal of mindfulness. So the Buddha spent his final hours between two sal trees, surrounded by the community of his disciples, surrounded by the local villages, the local people where he was based. And from the accounts, you can see that he was very, very concerned about the people around him whilst he was dying. He had a particular extraordinary mindfulness to bear and contain the kind of pain and the difficulty he was experiencing from his illness and from dying, and just to be really available for the people around him. So there's some examples of this in the story. I'll just tell you a few of those. So his close friend and attendant Ananda was really distressed that the Buddha was dying. And the Buddha was really concerned to reassure Ananda and to encourage him and to rejoice in him. He rejoiced in his merits to lift his spirits. Then there was a man who came to see the Buddha and was turned away. He wanted to seek ordination in the Buddha's community of disciples, but he was turned away because the Buddha was dying. But the Buddha heard about this and asked for the man to be brought to see him. And he was very concerned for this man's spiritual path. And it turned out he ordained this man. He ordained this man into his community of followers in his final hours. And then he's really concerned to make sure there's no outstanding questions. Does anybody in the community, any of the disciples, have any questions they want to ask the Buddha before he dies? So all the way through his final hours, there's just this constant mindfulness and attention to the people around him, a care for the people around him. And then the people, his followers say they have no questions. So then just before he dies, the Buddha has a final sentence of advice, of counsel to give to his followers. So you could imagine the care he's taken already in his final hours, that the final words that he chose, he'd have to take really great care about. So what were the final words of the Buddha? The Buddha said, listen monks, to my counsel, listen to my advice. And then the Pali phrase that the Buddha used was Vayadhamma Sankara Apamadena Sampadeta. So Vayadhamma Sankara is usually translated something like all compounded things will decay. Sometimes scholars, as you can imagine, disagree about this, and some scholars think it means all compounded things will disappoint or decay. But then the final two words, apamadena sampadeta, is usually translated as with mindfulness, strive on. And then these were the Buddha's final words, and he passed into final nibbana. So what the Buddha chose as his final phrase of advice to his disciples is usually translated with mindfulness, strive on. Now, this is often misinterpreted in the West and with translations, because our usual version of mindfulness means something very different to what the Buddha was talking about in his final words. So the Buddha wasn't saying, strive on with being really aware about the taste of raisins, which is sometimes what mindfulness is thought of as. The Buddha wasn't saying, strive on with colouring in pictures really carefully, which is also what mindfulness is sometimes meant to be. And the Buddha wasn't saying, strive on with having a mindfulness app on your phones. He wasn't saying that either. So what advice was the Buddha giving to his disciples and to us 2,500 years ago? What does it mean, apamadena sampadeta? So mada means drunk, to be drunk or intoxicated. And pa means really. So it means really drunk or blind drunk, to be really intoxicated. And the letter A means not. So basically what the Buddha was saying is not to be really drunk, which kind of, when I say it out loud, does actually sound quite funny. But it's not literal. This phrase is a particular apamada, is a particular type of awareness, a quality of mindfulness, which is really vigilant. So it's avoiding being intoxicated by sense experience. So when we're in the grip of craving or hatred, and we've got no control over our actions, it's like we are blind drunk, like a person who has no control over their actions. And in this way, when we're intoxicated with sense experience or craving or desire or hatred, we're like that. We've got no control over our actions. So we're at the mercy of our habits. We're caught up in the wheel of previous action. And appamada is the vigilance to be aware of being in the gap, to be aware of ethical choices, right in the middle of that dangerous situation where you might react or you might get in the grip of craving or hatred. It's having the awareness, the vigilance to be in the gap and to act skillfully. It means not being on automatic pilot. And it means remembering the commitments you've made. So if you've got a particular commitment to practicing the 5 precepts, so if you become a mitra, you'll hear later, that means you make a commitment to practicing the 5 precepts. Ordination involves making a commitment to practice 10 ethical precepts. So appamada means having that vigilance in that dangerous situation to remember your precepts, your vows, and not to become intoxicated. So I was just thinking about an example of my own, just in a situation where I try and be vigilant at the moment is in the morning when I'm trying to get my children ready for school and nursery, and I can get stressed, and when I get stressed I get a bit short-tempered or just not as as warm as I would like to be. So in that situation, like this morning for example, I can notice that I'm starting to get stressed, and then appamada can kick in, vigilance can kick in and say, you're starting to get stressed, you can calm down, you can relax, you can just enjoy this, you can have fun. So that, you obviously have your own situations where you get caught up in these habits where you're not able to, where you need to have that vigilance, that appamada. And this is what the Buddha was stressing to his followers. This is what will lead to enlightenment. These were the final words, to be vigilant and not be intoxicated. So the Buddha phrased this as saying this is the key to success, this is the key to awakening. In another sutta, the Buddha describes appamada as what led him to enlightenment. And there's a whole chapter in the Dhammapada praising appamada. So the Buddha obviously thought this was crucial, this type of mindfulness was crucial, but it isn't colouring in, unfortunately. It's not, that might be relaxing, but it's not the key to enlightenment. So appamada is one of 3 different terms. In the Pali Suttas, there's 3 different terms that all get translated as mindfulness. So I think it's worth just unpacking what the different ways the Buddha talked about mindfulness so we can get a kind of sense of what mindfulness means, what the Buddha's teaching of mindfulness means. So the first is appamada, which I've talked about. And then the second is sati, and the third is sampajana. So sati literally means recollecting. But in practice it means being mindful of something, turning your attention to something, bringing your attention to something. And there's lots of different things we can be mindful of or bring our attention to. So there's the Buddhanusati practice in Buddhism, which means recollecting the Buddha, mindfulness of the Buddha, bringing your attention to the example of the Buddha and recollecting that. And I'll talk more about that later. There's also the Anapanusati, which means mindfulness of breathing. You can bring your attention to the breath, which we'll be doing later after the tea break. And there's also the Satipatthanas, which is a very famous Buddhist teaching, a list talking about that the Buddha gave, describing the foundations of sati, the foundations of mindfulness, what you can bring your attention to moment by moment, which include the body, whether our sensations are pleasant or unpleasant, Vedana, and chitta, which means our thoughts and emotions, and dharmas, which can be translated as sometimes reality or the lists of the Dharma. So sati is often talked about as being in the moment. That's what often people think about with mindfulness. And that's because when you recollect something or place your attention on it, it means you're keeping your attention with the exact experience of whatever it is you're being mindful of, whatever it is happening, whatever it is you're experiencing right now in the present moment. And I've been watching Kung Fu Panda a lot with my little boy Robert, and there's a kind of master in Kung Fu Panda, and he says to the panda, this moment is a gift, that's why it's called the present. which I liked. Yeah. So sati is what's usually thought of in mindfulness. It's being in the present, bringing your attention to something, placing it on it. And there's also sampajana, which the Buddha talks about, which it can be described as a continuity of purpose. It means keeping in mind the broader picture of what's going on, your overall goal or purpose. It's an awareness of the context of this moment. It kind of gives this moment meaning, really. It's the kind of bigger picture that gives this moment context and meaning. So without sampajana, the present moment is a bit meaningless, actually. It's a bit lost. And there's in a lecture I've been studying in preparation for this, a lecture Sangharakshita gave, I think probably in the 60s. It was called Levels of Awareness in the Noble Eightfold Path series. You can listen to it on Free Buddhist Audio. And he gives an example of a lack of sampajana, a lack of purpose, direction of purpose. So he imagines a situation, and this is back in the 60s, it's quite a dated example, but imagine when you're writing a letter. I don't know if anyone remembers writing a letter. And the letter's urgent because you're trying to catch the post before the final post. But just then the phone rings. I don't know if you ever remember having a phone in your house and it not ringing. And just then the phone rings and a friend wants to talk to you, and you get engaged in a conversation. And you kind of lose track of time. It might be half an hour, it might be an hour of chatting to your friend. You completely forget about the letter. And then because you've been talking a lot, you're thirsty, so you go into the kitchen and you put the kettle on to boil. So it might have even been not an electric kettle. You put the kettle on to boil. And then you hear the sound of music coming from the radio next door, which sounds really pleasant. And you get drift away and you think, I'd like to listen to that. So you put your own radio on. And you forget about the kettle, which is boiling away in the kitchen. Then the doorbell goes and another friend comes to visit you. And you remember about the kettle because you offer him a cup of tea, so you go and make the tea. And then you remember about the letter that you meant to write all that time ago, and now it's too late to make the final post. So it's a kind of comical, but maybe a kind of familiar example of how we can just get distracted. And there's a quote that Sangharakshita uses in another lecture from T.S. Eliot, where he talks about being distracted from distraction by distraction. So it's like we start off with one particular purpose, then we get distracted from that. And then we get distracted again from our distraction by another distraction. And we just completely forget what we intended to start out to do. And Sangharakshita says, with a very strong continuity of purpose, we're less likely to get distracted. We'll have a wholehearted concentration, and we're less likely to get distracted. So sampajana is a mindfulness of your purpose, your goal. And it might be a long-term purpose like awakening or joining the order. Or, it might be a shorter-term goal like writing a talk, which was my task. It's a mindfulness of your task and trying to remember that. So you might be thinking, okay, well, what is your task? What did you set out to achieve? And try not to get distracted from that. So if your task was to write a talk, then why are you watching football highlights on the TV? And if your task is to follow the breath, why are you thinking about the conversation you had in the tea break? You've become distracted. So sampajana is being able to keep a thread, a continuity of purpose, and noticing when you've come away from that, coming back to the purpose. And the Buddha encouraged a practice of sampajana throughout the whole day, even when his disciples were asleep, to keep just an awareness of what they were doing and why they were doing it, their purpose. So there was a disciple called Mahanama who he taught the recollection of the Buddha practice to, the Buddhanusati practice. And after he describes the practice, he says, Mahanama, you should develop this recollection of the Buddha while you are walking, while you are standing, while you are sitting, while you are lying down, while you are busy at work, while you are resting in your home crowded with children. So basically he's saying, whatever you're doing, keep this purpose in mind, keep this sati in mind. And this is the practice of sampajana, just a continuity, a thread of purpose throughout what you're doing. And you can imagine this huge momentum of concentration and a powerful sense of purpose being cultivated over time if we keep doing that. So there's these three aspects of mindfulness, these three ways the Buddha talked about mindfulness. Sati, sampajana and appamada. And you could think of these as a mindfulness of the past, present and future. So you could see, obviously, sati as being mindfulness of the present, just what's happening now, bringing your attention to that. And appamada, you could see as a mindfulness of the commitments, the vows, the intentions you've made in the past, whether it's to practice the 5 precepts or not to snap in a particular situation. So you've got a vigilance of those past vows or precepts that you've made for yourself. And sampajana is a mindfulness of the future. What is it you're looking to achieve? What is your task? What is your goal? And again, it could be a main underlying drive in your life, or just a short-term task that you're looking to do at the moment. So you could see mindfulness in this way, mindfulness of past, present and future. So just from unpacking that teaching of the Buddha, you can see the Buddha's teaching of mindfulness was multifaceted, and it was subtle, and it contained connections to past vows, to the present, and to our future goals and aspirations. During this series of talks, we've been looking at the original teachings of the Buddha, but sometimes how they've been distorted over time, and also how we need to bring them back to what their true meaning, but also bring them back into this kind of future situation and look at how they might apply to us in our time, in our situation. So there are a couple of ways that the Buddha's teaching of mindfulness has been distorted, both over time and by the way it's popularly taught and thought of, mindfulness. And these are quite narrow interpretations of mindfulness that focus mainly on just being in the moment, and also they focus mainly on yourself, mindfulness of your inner world, your own emotions and feelings. So the first distortion is that, it's a practice of sati, a focus on being in the moment, but without sampajana, without any kind of purpose, any kind of long-term purpose. And you can see why modern mindfulness teachers emphasize being in the moment, because we're so distracted. Our minds might be really in the past or with stories, with papancha, so there is a real need to come back into the present moment. But that isn't all mindfulness is, as you've just seen. So it's misleading to stress that as what mindfulness is on its own. It gives a distorted picture. And there's an emphasis in some traditions about the practice of sati, of being in the moment, as being a kind of very slow, deliberate movement of the body. And that could be seen as a distortion, and also just not really appropriate or helpful in a busy life. If you've got a busy life and you want to engage with the world, moving very deliberately and slowly isn't going to be that helpful to you. So if you want to have an impact on the world and be engaged in the world, this presentation of mindfulness isn't going to be that helpful to you. And there's a classic example that gets given on retreats at Padmaloka, the men's retreat centre, of doing the washing up with this kind of distorted view of moment-to-moment mindfulness. So Padmavajra talks about watching people, or going into the kitchen, seeing people just washing the dishes, washing a plate really carefully, really mindfully, really slowly, like feeling the hands and the bubbles against the hand in the water and the heat of the water. And the plate is pristine, but it might take kind of 3 minutes to wash the plate, and it's really clean. But then there's a pile of 90 plates that need to be washed, and there's a team of other people trying to wash the plates, and the next thing on the schedule is in half an hour. So there's a complete loss of sampajana, complete loss of context and purpose, just a real focus on trying to be in the moment and wash the plate, be the plate, kind of wash the plate. And it's just a loss of context, a loss of sampajana. So there's also a second distortion, which is a sati, being in the present, but without appamada, without an ethical sense, an ethical vigilance. And there's a danger that of pamada, of becoming really intoxicated. And we can become really intoxicated with ourself if we're not careful. Our experience of our inner world and our feelings and our emotions and our psychology can become so fascinating to us that we just become intoxicated. And we can become kind of alienated from the world and the people around us. So unfortunately, you do see this with Buddhists, and I think I fell prey to this myself as well. You just get intoxicated with your inner world, and you lose that kind of... Well, in a way, ethics are all about other people. So the ethics are based on loving kindness, generosity. They're based on awareness of other people. So if you lose that, if you have no sense of ethics and appamada, and just trying to be with your experience of yourself, you can get intoxicated, you can lose connection, and you become alienated from yourself even, and from other people. And there are you see sometimes, unfortunately, some very extreme forms of this kind of cold, alienated mindfulness, which doesn't include other people and metta. So apparently Zen schools have some Zen schools of Buddhism can teach a kind of cold, meta-free mindfulness. And apparently this was used by soldiers to be able to kill people mindfully, this kind of approach of a kind of a cold Zen mindfulness. And obviously there's a complete loss of ethical sensitivity, ethical awareness in that situation. Quite an extreme example. In the 1960s in London, when Sangharakshita returned to the UK from India, Sangharakshita, the founder of our tradition, he was quite disturbed to see some people practicing a so-called Vipassana meditation approach, which he saw people having a very cold, alienated type of mindfulness, and he was concerned that some of the people he encountered were actually getting into psychotic states of just being disembodied, disconnected through this alienated approach to mindfulness. So there's a few distortions and a few dangers. So I wanted to just, at this point, bring in a teaching from Sangharakshita, where he talks about focus and breadth with mindfulness, and particularly in meditation, but also outside of meditation. And this can be a very helpful teaching to avoid some of these dangers that I just mentioned. So we do need to focus on the object of attention or mindfulness, but we can have our focus in quite a narrow, forced way, which can lead to an alienated awareness, or we can focus in quite a light, relaxed way, which has a more broad, natural state of awareness. So I'll try and explore this just to explain what these different types of focus might be like, a kind of narrow, forced focus, or more relaxed, broader focus. So the example I think of is, imagine that you're looking at a landscape and there's a tree in the distance in the landscape. So you might choose to focus your gaze on this tree, and you could do that quite forcefully and try and kind of block out the rest of the landscape. Or you could have quite a relaxed focus on that tree and just take in the rest of the landscape, whilst also staying focused on the tree. You could see all the other animals, other movement, other sensations. So you could have a focus, focus on that object of concentration, that tree, which is quite broad and relaxed and more natural, or it can be very narrow. So you can wash the dishes very mindfully and cleanly, but you could also do it quickly with lots of energy, which kind of keeps a sense of purpose and context, which is a kind of more broader, including context and appamada and sampajana. So maybe in meditation, if you're focusing on the breath in mindfulness of breathing, it could be quite a narrow, forced concentration on the breath, where you're trying to just block out the rest of your experience. Or it could be a kind of more relaxed, broader focus on the breath, which allows the rest of your experience, the body, emotions, noises, other people. And you can still stay with the breath, stay focused with the breath, but in a more relaxed way. So there's this teaching of focus and breadth, and ideally we're looking for mindfulness which has both focus and breadth. Maybe the term mindfulness itself is unhelpful because it might suggest a kind of special type of attention, so we can get tricked into trying to kind of force ourselves to pay attention. But actually, Sangharakshita also uses the phrase awareness for mindfulness, which can suggest maybe a more natural, relaxed, paying attention to things as we normally would. It suggests a more natural, alive, vividly alive state, awareness. So Sangharakshita has kind of tried to bring this teaching of mindfulness, the Buddha's teaching of mindfulness, back home to us in a helpful way with a particular list. It's a list called The Four Levels of Awareness. And again, it's in the same lecture called The Levels of Awareness in the Noble Eightfold Path series. So Sangharakshita, you can see it's quite a broad list that includes a range of things that we need to be mindful of in our experience. So it begins by talking about things, being aware of things, being mindful of things. By things, he says, he just means our outer world, material things, nature, our environment. We need to become more aware of nature and our environment. And we're not aware, he says, because we don't stop and look. We don't stop and pay attention and really look at nature. We have a kind of vague, peripheral awareness of our environment, but we've never... He asks a question, which is, how many hours today have you spent just stopping and looking at something? Or how many minutes or seconds have you even at all stopped to look at anything? And I mean, I'd be quite ashamed to admit that a lot of the time, I go months sometimes without even looking at the sky. vaguely know the sky is there, but I just don't stop and look at the sky, which is beautiful and full of colour and texture and changing all the time. But I often go really long periods of time just forgetting the sky is there, really, to look at it. And that's, and I'm in a kind of state of mind of being busy, thinking I'm busy and a bit alienated, a bit disconnected from the world around me. And one time I was in this state at a retreat in Padmaloka, and a friend of mine called Pramodia, who's German, a German order member, he took me out on a walk, and he might have been able to tell I was in this kind of slightly alienated, disconnected, kind of busy state. And we stopped and looked at a tree in the village of Surlingham, and he said he really loves this tree, Pramodia really loves this tree, and he calls it a bodhisattva tree. And he talked about all the length of time, the history, the decades the tree's been there, all the insects that live in the tree, the particular shape that I really loves of the tree. And I had to, it basically lifted me out of my current state of consciousness into a very, very different, more connected state of awareness. For me, it's really important to try and remember if I can remember to look at trees, and I discovered that each tree has got a different personality. Each tree looks completely different and is completely different, but usually I just have in my mind tree, and I don't really look at it or stop to think about it. It's just tree. So, an awareness of things means stopping and paying attention to, looking at, listening to the world around us. And Sangharakshita describes becoming an ideal state, really, of becoming supremely receptive to the world around us, almost becoming fused with it, becoming one with it. It's, not separated from it. So that's this first area, awareness of things. And then Sangharakshita also talks then about awareness of self, which we're probably familiar with mindfulness of ourself. So to begin with, he talks about mindfulness of the body, which is also talked a lot about by the Buddha in the list of satipatthanas that I mentioned earlier. And this is about being aware of the body, what the body is doing all of the time, like the Buddha described earlier with Bodhinaga. It's the same with the mindfulness of the body. Just all the time, whatever you're doing, being aware of the body's movements. And it implies being aware of purpose as well. Why is your body moving? Why are you doing these things with your body? And Sangharakshita says that this means, with this awareness of your body, you can't really do anything in a chaotic way, in a distracted way. So it encourages sampajana, it encourages mindfulness of purpose. And he gives the example of a Japanese tea party, which is a very traditional, historical and beautiful ceremony, which every action is done deliberately with awareness, and he says with dignity and peace and harmony. So, and he contrasts that with, at the time, what he thought was a ceremony, a ceremony in the culture at the time, which he said was a business lunch, which he said kind of summed up our approach to eating, which was to try and do two things at the same time. And one was to eat a really good lunch, and the other thing was to make a really good deal. And he basically said it's kind of kind of captures our approach at the time, the approach at the time. So a friend of mine, Achara, had a phrase which I really liked, which was, I think it was his phrase. I remember him saying it to me, which was to do one thing beautifully. Do one thing beautifully. So just do one thing at a time and do that beautifully. Do it well. So this is awareness of the body, this part of awareness of self. And then Sangharakshita talks about awareness of what he calls feelings, but he's talking about emotions. And he says he describes awareness a bit like a philosopher's stone or a kind of an alchemist's jewel. Awareness can really transform our inner world, our emotions. So he describes this process of how that works, and he uses the example of anger. He says to begin with, we might just become aware that we've been angry and regret it. It's already happened, and we notice afterwards and we regret it. But then the process, if we keep bringing awareness to our inner world, the process will happen where we are aware that we're being angry right now. That's the kind of next stage in the process. And then afterwards, with time, we can become aware that anger is starting to arise, and there's more chance to do something about it. And then eventually, he says, well, the emotion just subsides altogether, or it's more under control. And then he talks about thoughts, awareness of thoughts. And Sangharakshita, I think he's probably accurate for me and for a lot of people when he says there's often no directed, deliberate thinking. We just allow thoughts to drift, or train of thoughts kind of hop from one association to another association. We just kind of get thought. We're not in control of the thinking. But Danny has this phrase sometimes, we get thunk. Kind of thinking happens to us, but we're not in control of it, really. So Sangharakshita describes awareness of thoughts as watching from moment to moment where thoughts arise. And particularly this is going to happen most in meditation, I imagine, but watching where thoughts arise and then where they go to. And when I'm particularly aware and concentrated, I really like it when I can just notice I've been distracted and then notice a series of thoughts and trace it back to when I was last concentrated. I don't know if other people experience that, but I like doing that, kind of just tracing a thought. I thought of that because I thought of that previously, and I thought of that, and I was aware then, I was concentrated. So you can kind of watch your thoughts and train your thoughts in a way and become more aware of your thoughts. And he describes a state of mind where if you're watching thoughts in meditation, thoughts start to still, the mind starts to still, and then thinking, discursive, like incessant chatter drops away, and there can become silence and inner stillness and silence. And he says that's when meditation really, really begins, with that inner stillness and silence. But he describes awareness as being like this kind of magic element. If you introduce awareness to your emotions and thoughts, they transform. The emotions get refined, the thinking gets transformed. Okay. And then this is where I think Sangharakshita's list is brilliant, actually, because it brings in awareness of others, it brings in metta, it brings in ethics, other people. Sangharakshita says we also need to be aware of other people. And this helps us to avoid getting stuck up our proverbial backsides and getting lost with our inner world and how fascinating our inner world is. We also need to be aware of other people. They exist and they have feelings as well. They have inner worlds as well. So Sangharakshita said in this lecture, we need to be aware of other people, as persons, not as things out there. And he says we do this actually by really looking at them, and probably in the same way as we do by looking at trees in the sky. We take them in, we really look at them. And he says it's not staring at them, like to freak them out. But it says something very striking. You might go your whole life without ever really looking at somebody properly or being looked at. It sounds really sad that people might have that experience. But some of you may have experienced something we do on retreats called communication exercises, which is a real privilege where you get to sit and just look at another person, look at another person in the first stage of the exercise. And yet really experiment with just taking them in, really learning to look and see another person, trying not to burst into hysterical laughter because it can feel very uncomfortable to begin with until you relax into it. So awareness of others very obviously broadens mindfulness from being quite narrow about ourselves in the moment. It broadens it out to include other people, to include metta, relationships and ethics. It also involves an awareness of the appropriateness in communicating with others. So other people might not be as interested as we are in the minutiae of our inner world and our psychology. They might not also be in a position to cope with us kind of vomiting our difficulties all over them. So there's a kind of a mindfulness of other people, really, and the appropriateness of our communication in relation to other people. Okay. Interesting. I'm doing better than I thought for time. I had some caffeine earlier, which I don't usually do. And I've probably been going at a faster pace than usual, but it's good. My brief was to kind of be mindful of the time, which I think I've done. Sampajana, practice of Sampajana. So, in line with our theme, we need to, again, Sangharakshita's list does bring the teaching of mindfulness back to the original teaching of the Buddha's teaching of mindfulness. But we also need to bring that teaching into our current culture, our current age and time. And you can tell from the examples I gave of Sangharakshita that already our culture is very different to the time of when Sangharakshita gave this lecture in the 60s. We've got distraction on steroids. We've got this super distractions with our social media, our smartphones, our devices. Most internets and sites and apps are designed to distract you, to take your attention, to divert your attention. So we've got a much harder, I think, job with distraction than maybe in the 60s. We've got modern versions of distraction. So I don't use Facebook as much anymore, but I remember sometimes I might go online, maybe go to Facebook with an idea I had a particular purpose, a particular task I was going there to do. But very, very quickly I'd become distracted by alerts or by a feed. And then before I know it, like I just spent maybe an hour or half an hour or a period of time just doing something completely different to what I'd set out to do. So a complete loss of purpose, a complete loss of mindfulness, really. So in that kind of cyber world with our devices, our smartphones, we kind of lose sense of purpose very, very easily. We can lose sense of reality too, because a lot of the stuff we encounter online is just stories of kind of, this Buddhist word papancha means kind of proliferation. It's just kind of stories about maybe celebrities, about football, or about whatever it is. They just get lost in these kind of these stories online. We can lose connection with the world around us. You can kind of become disembodied, alienated from the world around us. I don't know if you experience that the same as I do. And then with Sangharakshita's example of the business lunch, well, we've got distraction on steroids again. Our version of the Japanese tea ceremony might be that we're trying to eat a meal at the same time as watching TV, whilst we're looking at our phone. And on our phone, we might be trying to book a ticket, we might be checking our emails, and also trying to talk to our housemate or our partner or at the same time. So we might be trying to do 6 or 7 different things at the same time whilst we're eating a meal. So we've got so much more distraction going on and complexity that we need to work with. So I just want to look at these 3. Maybe I'll go back to this list from the start of the 3 types of mindfulness. Where have we got it? Appamada, Sati and Sampajana. And just give some suggestions about how we could try and cultivate mindfulness in our, for ourselves in our lives and our current situation. So I've lost my page. Okay, so appamada. There's a phrase to describe appamada which I love. Can be called guarding the gates to your senses. So it's as though your attention, your mindfulness is like a guard at the gate to a city, and you're watching very carefully what comes in and out of your sense perception. What you're looking at, what you're hearing, and the effect it's going to have on your state of mind. So you're really carefully guarding the gates of your senses, guarding the input that you receive, that you expose yourself to. So it's a very obvious use of this appamada, this vigilance and guarding the senses would be to limit your screen time, limit the amount of time we have in front of screens, to use our devices less, use less devices. And if you go on retreat, particularly to somewhere, I know Pamaloka best because it's where I go most often, they're now device-free zones. You're not allowed to take devices, use devices on retreat there. Because of this, it's a place where you're trying to cultivate mindfulness, cultivate a vivid awareness and an appamada. So you could think about reducing screen time, limiting screen time. Another way of working with appamada, which we talk about when we have urban retreats at the Buddhist Centre, is to remind ourselves. We set reminders about precepts or vows, intentions that we've taken. So maybe you have a precept to use less screen time, or it might be a completely different intention you set, a different precept to be more generous or more truthful, or whatever it might be. You can make a reminder that you're going to see somewhere visible. It might be changing the password to your computer. So whenever you try to log on, you're prompted, you're reminded that you've made yourself a precept or a vow. It might mean you wear your watch on a different wrist. So whenever you go to look at the time, you're reminded of this particular precept. So you can help yourself with appamada by thinking about different reminders you could place in your everyday situations. And then sati, this awareness, mindfulness of the present moment. For me, body awareness is something that has been really, really important. For me, trying to keep, like the Buddha describes, almost a continuous sense of what my body feels like, the sensations of my body, means I'm very much more kind of anchored and grounded in what's happening now. I'm less likely to kind of get carried away, become intoxicated, I suppose. That practice of sati, mindfulness of the body, helps to anchor me. So that's really been really important for me. And there's a very obvious advice to spend more time in nature. go outside and look at things. And Sangharakshita describes looking at a tree, but he said also you might even look at a house or a fence. Just look at something and just take it in. Just really look at it. We've got so much nature around us in Sheffield. We've got beautiful botanical gardens. We've got beautiful gardens here. We've got the Peak District. So get out there and look at it, take it in, listen to it, experience it. So this is cultivating sati, getting away from the screens, getting out into nature. And then sampajana, cultivating this mindfulness of purpose. And as I heard, you heard right at the start, this can be really powerful over time. You can really build up a momentum of direction, mindfulness of purpose. So you could try just trying to do one thing at a time, do one thing well, stick to one thing. And in another lecture, Sangharakshita suggests eating mindfully, the opposite to the business lunch. If you just decide to have one meal a day where you eat it mindfully, where you taste the food, really pay attention to the experience of eating, he says you'll really cultivate a strong practice of mindfulness. And it's a practice of mindfulness of purpose, trying to stay with your intention of being mindful of your meal. Something for me, this is advice to me, but maybe advice to you as well, is to remember to complete things that you've started. Because you can get distracted and you lose your sense of purpose, but you can go back to it. Even if you got distracted for a few weeks, you can go back and finish a task that you started and have a discipline of going back, making sure you complete the tasks, don't leave them unfinished. And that can cultivate a continuity of purpose. And very obviously, the mindfulness of breathing meditation helps to cultivate all of these things, really, all of these aspects of mindfulness. You're really fully trying to vividly experience your breath, your body, your emotions, whatever it is you're experiencing. And trying to train your mind to focus, ideally kind of in a relaxed, natural way, on the breath, stay with the breath, but with a broader awareness of the other elements of your experience as well. And every time your mind wanders and gets distracted, you bring it back to the purpose, you cultivate that continuity of purpose, and you have a real vigilance for the hindrances, things that might take your mind away from its purpose. You have a real sense of apamada, of vigilance in the practice. So we'll be doing the mindfulness of breathing after the tea break. So it is try and bring some of those into the mindfulness of breathing. So just to end with, I just want to go back to what is the real point of mindfulness. What was it that the Buddha was suggesting, his final advice as he lay dying to his disciples, to us? What was it that he stressed? It was basically apamada, being in the gap. And why is that important? Well, apamada is important, mindfulness is important, because we can become in charge of our own destiny. We can use the law of karma to act skillfully, and we can take charge of the future we have by our choices in the present moment. If we're in the gap, if we have that vigilance, we're not on automatic pilot, we become in charge of our future and our destiny. And we do this, we act ethically as well, because we will suffer less. We will suffer less through the practice of apamada if we are more and more ethical. Our mind will become clearer and we'll become liberated from false views. We'll start to see more clearly. We'll get where we want to be. We will achieve our purpose if we can cultivate sampajana. We'll make decisions that bring about a future that we want, and we will bring it about. That future will happen. So it isn't about colouring in, unfortunately. It's about something very, very much more powerful and radical than that. So, don't waste your life being distracted. Become more awake to the real purpose of life, which is becoming vividly awake, vividly aware. So practice mindfulness and become more and more awake, more and more wakeful, more and more vividly alive to things, to yourself, to others, and to reality.